The world is ending in the year 476 CE, not on fire or flood, but in the gradual, unavoidable fall of humanity's greatest empire has ever been aware. The enormous Western Roman Empire had been straddling the Mediterranean for centuries. Ultimately, lets forth its final breath when the last emperor is removed from power by a Germanic chieftain named Odos. His throne, once marching in perfect line across 3 continents, the legions now fall silent. The roads that linked the everlasting metropolis with far-off provinces grew deserted. The administrative apparatus that has been in charge of millions of people just stops working in what would eventually be known as France. This collapse produces a human phenomenon that has never been seen before: history. A gap so vast and profound that it will take a millennium to fill. This darkness will give rise to something that is neither Roman nor barbarian, but something quite different. The civilization that will produce cathedrals and knights, to crusades and courtly love, to scholars and saints, how will alter the fundamental tenets of human thought. This is France's medieval history, a tally that begins in the ashes of empire and ends with the birth of the modern world. It is a story of kings who claimed divine right while battling for every scrap of territory, of peasant shoe-built cathedrals that touched the heavens while living in mud and straw, of warriors who fought for honor and glory while the very concept of honor was being redefined with each passing generation. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself be carried back across the centuries to a time when the map of Europe was rewritten by the sword, when the fate of kingdoms hung on the outcome of single battles, when the line between history and legend was so thin that it barely existed at all. We will walk with Clovis as he unites the Frankish tribes, stand with Charlemagne as he is crowned by the Pope himself, and witness the rise of the Capetian dynasty that will rule France for over 3 centuries. But this is not merely a recitation of dates and battles, though both will play their part in our story. This is the tale of how a collection of warring tribes transformed themselves into a nation, how a patchwork of petty kingdoms became the most powerful realm in medieval Europe, how the very idea of France was forged in the crucible of constant warfare, political intrigue, and cultural transformation. The stage is set in what the Romans called Gaul, a land of dense forests and fertile plains, of Celtic tribes and Roman cities, of ancient traditions and imperial innovations, as the empire crumbles. This territory becomes a prize to be seized by whoever possesses the strength and cunning to claim it. The Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes, who had served both as federati allies and enemies of Rome, emerged as dominant force in this new landscape. Their story begins not with conquest, but with conversion, not with clash of armies, but with the whispered prayers of a king who would change the course of history through a single act of faith. For, in the year 496, a Frankish chieftain named Clovis will kneel before a Christian bishop and emerge as something the world has never seen before. A barbarian king who rules by divine right. A Germanic warrior who claims the blessing of the Roman Church. The founder of a dynasty that will endure for nearly 3 centuries. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The collapse of Rome did not happen overnight, and the rise of medieval France was not the work of a single generation. It was a process that unfolded across centuries, shaped by countless individuals whose names have been forgotten, but whose actions echo through history. It was built on the bones of Roman cities and the foundations of Celtic hill forts, on the fusion of Germanic law and Christian theology, on the marriage of barbarian vitality and classical learning. The world that emerges from this fusion will be unlike anything that came before. It will be a realm where power is measured not in legions, but in the loyalty of sworn vassals. Where wealth flows not from taxation, but from the produce of the land. Where authority derives not from citizenship, but from birth and divine favor. It will be a civilization that produces both the most beautiful art and the most devastating warfare, that creates both the Crusaders and the universities, that gives birth to both the Inquisition and the Code of Chivalry. This medieval France will be a land of contradictions, where the same nobles who spend their days in brutal warfare will commission illuminated manuscripts of exquisite beauty, where the same church that preaches peace will blesseth weapons of crusading knights, where the same peasants who live in grinding poverty will donate their labor to build cathedrals that rival the pyramids in their ambition and far surpass them in their artistry. The story we are about to tell spans nearly 1,000 years from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance. It encompasses the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth of new forms of government, the development of new technologies of war and peace, the creation of new forms of art and literature, the emergence of new ways of understanding the relationship between God and humanity, between ruler and subject, between individual and community. We will witness the transformation of a collection of barbarian tribes into the most sophisticated civilization of the medieval world. We will see how the Franks, who began as raiders and mercenaries on the fringes of the Roman Empire, became the inheritors of Roman authority and the defenders of Christian civilization. We will follow the evolution of their kingdom from a simple warrior society into a complex feudal state, from a collection of personal loyalties into something approaching a modern nation. Along the way, we will encounter some of the most fascinating figures in all of history. There is Clovis I, Christian king of the Franks, who united the tribes through a combination of military genius and religious conviction. There is Charlemagne, the great emperor who revived the Roman Empire in the West and sparked the first great renaissance of medieval learning. There is Hucap, the Duke, who founded the dynasty that would rule France for over 3 centuries, and laid the foundations for the modern French state. We will meet Philip Augustus, the king who transformed France from a collection of feudal territories into a centralized monarchy, and won the greatest victory in medieval French history at the Battle of Bou. We will witness the extraordinary career of Louis Nim, the saint king who embodied the highest ideals of medieval kingship while leading to disastrous crusades. We will see the dramatic confrontation between Philip the Fair and Pope Boniface VIII that ended the medieval balance between church and state, and we will follow the long agony of the 100 Years' War. That great conflict that began as a feudal dispute and ended as a struggle between 2 emerging nations. We will see how the English victories at Cirey and Poitiers brought France to the brink of collapse, how the madness of Charles VI plunged the kingdom into civil war, how the intervention of Joan of Arc turned the tide of battle and gave birth to French national consciousness. But beyond the great figures and the decisive battles, we will also explore the daily life of medieval France. We will visit the villages where peasants work the fields according to rhythms that had changed little since fall of Rome. We will enter the workshops where craftsmen created the goods that made medieval commerce possible. We will climb the walls of the castles where nobles lived, lives of luxury built on the labor of their subjects. We will walk the streets of Paris as it grows from a small island settlement to the largest city in Europe. We will enter the great cathedral of Notre Dame as it traces stone by stone over the course of 2 centuries. We will attend the University of Paris as it becomes the intellectual center of the medieval world. We will witness the birth of Gothic architecture, the development of scholastic philosophy, the creation of vernacular literature. This is a story of transformation on every level: political, social, economic, cultural and spiritual. It is the story of how medieval France became the laboratory where the modern world was forged, where new forms of government were tested, where new relationships between rulers and subjects were established, where new ways of understanding the human condition were developed. The journey we are about to undertake will carry us through dark forests and bright clearings, through periods of chaos and moments of unprecedented achievement. We will see civilizations rise and fall, witness the birth of new institutions and the death of ancient traditions. Observe the eternal human struggle between order and freedom, between tradition and innovation, between the desire for security and the urge for conquest. As we begin this long journey through medieval centuries, remember that we are not merely observers, but participants in a story that continues to shape our world today. The institutions they created, the ideas they developed, the conflicts they fought, the solutions they found, all continue to influence how we organize your societies, how we understand our relationship with the divine, how we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. So settle back, close your eyes, and prepare to be transported to a world both alien and familiar, both distant and immediate, both foreign and foundational to everything we are today. The story of medieval France is about to begin. And it begins, as all great stories do, with an ending that becomes a beginning, with a collapse that becomes a creation, with the death of one world and the birth of another. In the year 476, as the last Roman emperor, the West is deposed by a barbarian chieftain. The stage is set for a drama that will unfold over the next 1,000 years. The actors are taking their places. The scenery is being arranged, and the first act of the great medieval epic is about to begin. The lights are red on the ancient world, and somewhere in the darkness, the future is waiting to be born. The silence that followed Rome's fall was not empty, but pregnant with possibility in the territories that had once echoed with the measured tread of legions. New sounds began to emerge: the ring of hammers on iron, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, the chanting of monks in stone chapels, the war cries of warriors who fought not for empire but for personal honor and the favor of their lords. The Franks who inherited this shattered landscape were not the savage barbarians of Roman propaganda, but a complex confederation of tribes who had been absorbing Roman culture for centuries. They had served as federati allied troops who fought alongside Roman legions against common enemies. They had settled in Roman territories, married Roman women, learned Roman law, and adopted Roman customs. Yet they remained fundamentally different from their imperial predecessors, bound not by citizenship, but by bonds of kinship and personal loyalty that stretched back to the Germanic forests of their ancestors. These were people who measured wealth in cattle and land rather than gold and silver, who settled disputes through trial by combat rather than legal precedent, who followed leaders chosen for their prowess in battle rather than their skill in administration. They brought with them a warrior culture that valued courage above all other virtues, that saw honor as more precious than life itself, that understood leadership as a personal relationship between chief and follower, or rather than an abstract institutional arrangement. Yet they also brought something else, a flexibility and adaptability that would prove crucial in the centuries to come. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of imperial Rome, Frankish society was fluid, allowing for social mobility based on merit and achievement. A successful warrior could rise from humble origins to become a chief a wise counselor could gain influence regardless of birth. A skilled craftsman could accumulate wealth and respect. This openness to change and innovation would become one of the defining characteristics of medieval French civilization. The man who would first harness these qualities to forge a kingdom was Clovis, whose name would echo through the centuries as the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, born around 466 into the royal house of Salon-Francs. Clovis inherited a realm that barely extended beyond the region around modern-day Belgium and northern France. His father, Childeric, had been a successful war leader, but his kingdom was just one of many Frankish territories scattered across what hadn't been Roman Gaul. What made Clovis different was not just his military skill, though he possessed that in abundance, but his political genius. He understood that the fragmented landscape of post-Roman Gaul presented both enormous opportunities and deadly dangers. The old imperial administration had collapsed, leaving a patchwork of competing authorities. Visigothic kings in the south, nobles in the east, Roman generals clinging to power in isolated cities, and rival Frankish chiefs controlling their own territories. It was a world where the strong preyed upon the weak, where today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, where survival depended on the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Clovis began his rise to power in 481, when he was still barely 15 years old. The boy king faced immediate challenges that would have overwhelmed a lesser leader. His realm was surrounded by enemies. His treasury was nearly empty, and his authority was questioned by rival claimants within his own family. Yet, Clovis possessed something that his enemies lacked: an intuitive understanding of the new world that was emerging from the ruins of the old. His first great victory came at the Battle of Sassin in 486, where he defeated Syagrius, the last Roman general to maintain independent authority in northern Gaul. This victory was significant, not just for its military consequence, but for what it symbolized: the final end of Roman power in the region, and the emergence of the Franks as the dominant force in the territories that would become France. The battle also revealed Clovis's tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire fierce loyalty in his followers, but military conquest was only the beginning of Clovis's strategy. He understood that lasting power required more than victory in battle. It demanded legitimacy, the acceptance of his authority by the diverse populations. He sought to rule in a world where the old Roman structures of law and administration had collapsed. Where could such legitimacy be found? Clovis found his answer in an institution that had not only survived the fall of Rome, but had actually ground stronger in the chaos that followed: the Christian Church, the conversion of Clovis to Christianity around 496 was one of the most consequential events in medieval history. Unlike many of his barbarian contemporaries who had adopted Arianism, a form of Christianity that denied the full divinity of Christ, Clovis embraced Nicene Christianity of Rome and Constantinople. This decision was influenced by his wife Clotilde, a Bindian princess who was already a Christian, but it was also a calculated political move that would have profound consequences for the future of France. By converting to Orthodox Christianity, Clovis aligned himself with the most powerful serving institution of the ancient world. The Church provided him with a ready-made administrative structure, a litrateclus of administrators, and most importantly, a source of legitimacy that transcended tribal loyalties. When Bishop Remedius of Rheims baptized Clovis in the cathedral of that city, he was not just welcoming a new convert to the faith, he was crowning the first Christian king of the Franks, creating a precedent that would shape French kingship for the next 13 centuries. The immediate practical benefits of conversion were enormous. The Gallo-Roman population, which had remained largely Christian under barbarian rule, now had a king who shared their faith. The bishops, who had become the de facto leaders of many cities after the collapse of imperial administration, found in Clovis a protector and patron. The monasteries, which were rapidly becoming centers of learning and economic activity, gained a royal defender of their interests. But the conversion had deeper implications that would only become clear over time. By embracing Christianity, Clovis was also embracing the intellectual and cultural heritage of the ancient world. The Church was the custodian of classical learning, the keeper of books and manuscripts, the maintainer of schools and libraries. Through his alliance with the Church, Clovis was connecting his barbarian kingdom to the great traditions of philosophy, law, and literature that had made Rome great. The fusion of Germanic warrior culture with Christian spirituality would become one of the defining characteristics of medieval civilization. The warrior's code of honor was transformed by Christian teachings about justice and mercy. The concept of personal loyalty was elevated by Christian notions of divine service. The tribal assembly became sanctified by Christian ritual and ceremony. Out of this fusion emerged new forms of kingship, new concepts of law, new understanding of the relationship between ruler and subject. Clovis's successors, known to history as the Merovingian dynasty, would rule the Frankish kingdom for nearly 3 centuries. Their reign was marked by both spectacular achievements and tragic failures, by moments of brilliant success and periods of devastating civil war. They created the first stable government in post-Roman Europe, established trade networks that connected the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and laid the foundations for the cultural renaissance that would follow. The Merovingian court was a fascinating blend of barbarian tradition and Roman sophistication. Kings wore their hair long as a symbol of their royal status, surrounded themselves with armed retainers bound by personal oaths of loyalty, and settled disputes through trial by combat. Yet they also issued laws modeled on Roman legal codes, maintained diplomatic relations with Constantinople and other distant courts, and patronized shelafs and the arts. The royal villa at Compiègne, where Merovingian King Softon held court, exemplified this cultural fusion, built in the Roman style with elaborate mosaics and heated baths. It was also equipped with a great hall where the king could feast with a treasury where tribute and plunder were stored, and quarters for the royal household that included not just family members, but also advisors, servants, and craftsmen from across the known world. The Merovingian economy was based primarily on agriculture, but it was far more sophisticated than is often imagined. The kings controlled vast estates, worked by both free peasants and slaves, operated mines that produced silver and iron, and maintained workshops that created goods for both domestic use and international trade. Frankish merchants traveled as far as Constantinople and beyond, bringing back silk, spices, and other luxury goods that demonstrated the kingdom's growing prosperity. Yet the Merovingian system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Frankish custom of partible inheritance, which divided the kingdom among all the sons of a deceased king, led to constant fragmentation and civil war. Brothers fought brothers for control of territories. Noble families switched sides according to their immediate interests, and the kingdom oscillated between unity and division with exhausting regularity. The most successful Merovingian rulers were those who managed to reunite the divided territories through conquest or negotiation. Dagobah, the first, who ruled from 629 to 639, was perhaps the last truly effective Merovingian king. He managed to unite most of the Frankish territories under his authority, defeated the Saxons in a series of campaigns, and presided over a period of relative peace and prosperity. His court at Paris became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars and artists from across Europe. But Dagobert's death marked the beginning of the end for effective Merovingian rule. His successors were increasingly dominated by powerful nobles who had accumulated vast estates and private armies. The most important of the Cenobles were the mayors of the palace, officials who had originally served as royal stewards, but who gradually usurped real power while leaving the kings as ceremonial figureheads. The transformation of the mayors of the palace from servants to masters was a gradual process that reflected broader changes in Frankish society. As the kingdom grew larger and more complex, the kings became increasingly reliant on a class of professional administrators and military commanders. These men, drawn from the great nobler families, accumulated offices, estates, and followers, until they rivaled the kings themselves in power and influence. The most successful of these nobler families was the Pippinids, later known as the Carolingians, who held the mayoralty of the palace in the eastern Frankish territory of Australia. A combination of military success, political cunning, and careful alliance building, they gradually extended their influence throughout the Frankish kingdom. By the early 8th century, they had become the real rulers of the Franks, while the Merovingian kings remained as sacred but powerless symbols of royal authority. The man who would complete this transformation was Charles, known to history as Charles Martel, the Hammer. Born around 688, Charles was the illegitimate son of Papin to Thepipenid, mayor of the palace. Despite his irregular birth, Charles possessed the qualities that medieval society valued most: exceptional military skill, political intelligence, and the ability to inspire fierce loyalty in his followers. When civil war erupted after his father's death, Charles emerged victorious and assumed control of the mayoralty. Charles Martel's greatest achievement was his victory over the Muslim forces at the Battle of Tea in 732. Triumph that earned him lasting fame as the savior of Christian Europe. The Muslim armies, which had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, had crossed the Pyrenees and were advancing deep into Frankish territory. The battle that ensued was one of the most decisive in European history, determining whether Europe would remain Christian or become part of the expanding Islamic world. The victory at Tours was not just a military triumph, but a political masterstroke that established Charles Martel as the undisputed leader of the Franks. He had saved Christian civilization from the Muslim threat, demonstrated his military superiority over all rivals, and won the gratitude of the Church and the Christian population. From this point forward, the Carolingian family would be seen as the true defenders of the faith and the rightful leaders of the Frankish people. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, would take the final step in the Carolingian rise to power in 751, with the support of Pope Zacharias. Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and had himself crowned as the first Carolingian king of the Franks. This momentous event marked not just a change of dynasty, but a transformation in the very nature of kingship. The Carolingians would rule not by right of conquest, but by divine sanction, blessed by the Church and responsible to God for the welfare of their subjects. The stage was now set for the emergence of the greatest figure in early medieval history, a man who would unite most of Western Europe under his rule and create an empire that rivaled Rome itself. The son of Pepin the Short would become known to history as Charlemagne, and his reign would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the story of medieval France, one that would see the barbarian kingdoms of the post-Roman world transformed into the foundation of modern European civilization. The crown that rested on Pippin the Short's head was more than mere gold and jewels. It was the symbol of a revolution that would reshape the very foundations of European power. When the Pope's sacred oil touched his brow in 751, it created something unprecedented. A barbarian king who ruled by right, a Germanic warrior who claimed the blessing of Rome's successor, the founder of a dynasty that would dominate Europe for centuries to come. Yet, even as Pepe consolidated his newfound royal authority, forces were already in motion that would elevate his house to heights that dwarfed even his own considerable achievements. In the royal palace at Aachen, a child was growing to manhood, who would become the most powerful ruler since Augustus Caesar, a figure so towering that his very name would become synonymous with imperial greatness. Charles, the eldest son of Pepin the Short, would grow up to become Charlemagne, and his reign would mark the true beginning of medieval Europe's golden age. The world that awaited this future emperor was one of extraordinary complexity and opportunity. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire had created a power vacuum that extended far beyond the borders of the Frankish kingdom. In Italy, the Lombards had established their own kingdom, but faced constant pressure from the Byzantine Empire and the growing temporal power of the Pope in Spain. The Umayyad Caliphate ruled a brilliant but isolated Islamic civilization that had little contact with the Christian kingdoms to the north. In Britain, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought endless wars among themselves while facing increasing pressure from Viking raiders. Beyond these immediate neighbors lay vast territories inhabited by pagan peoples who had never known Roman rule. The Saxons controlled much of what is now northern Germany, maintaining their ancient tribal customs and worshipping the old Germanic gods. The Avars dominated the Danube basin, ruling a nomadic empire that extracted tribute from settled peoples across Eastern Europe. The Slavs were expanding into the Balkans, creating new kingdoms and principalities that would challenge Byzantine authority for centuries to come. It was into this fragmented yet dynamic world that Charlemagne was born around 748. His childhood was spent in the court of his father, where he learned the skills that would make him the greatest ruler of his age. He mastered the arts of war and diplomacy, studied the classics of Latin literature, and absorbed the Christian faith that would guide his actions throughout his life. More importantly, he learned to understand the delicate balance of forces that held the Frankish kingdom together, the need to reward loyal followers while controlling ambitious nobles, the importance of maintaining good relations with the church while asserting royal authority, the challenge of governing diverse populations with different laws and customs. When Pepin the Short died in 768, his kingdom was divided between his two sons according to Frankish custom. Charles received the northern and western territories, while his younger brother Carlin inherited the southern and eastern regions. This division might have led to the kind of civil war that had plagued the Mevenian dynasty, but fate intervened in the form of Carlin's sudden death in 771. Charles moved quickly to claim his brother's inheritance, and for the first time in generations, the entire Frankish kingdom was united under a single ruler. The reunification of the Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne's sole authority marked the beginning of an era of expansion that would transform the map of Europe. Unlike his predecessors, who had been primarily concerned with defending their territories against external threats, Charlemagne possessed both the vision and the resources to pursue a systematic program of conquest and conversion. His armies would march to the four corners of the known world, carrying the banners of Christianity and Frankish power to peoples who had never submitted to any foreign authority. The first target of Charlemagne's expansion was the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy. The Lombards had been Athon in the side of the papacy for generations, controlling territories that the Pope claimed as part of the patrimony of St. Peter. When King Decidius of the Lombards threatened Rome itself, Pope Hadrian II appealed to Charlemagne for protection. The Frankish king's response was swift and decisive. In 773, he led a massive army across the Alps and besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia. The siege of Pavia lasted for 10 months, during which Charlemagne demonstrated his military skill and his political acumen. Rather than simply destroying the Lombard kingdom, he sought to integrate it into his expanding empire. He married Decidius' daughter, negotiated with Lombard nobles who were willing to submit to his authority, and carefully preserved the administrative structures that had made the Lombard kingdom function. When Pavia finally fell in 774, Charlemagne didn't just conquer the Lombards, he became their king, adding the Iron Crown of Lombardy to his growing collection of royal titles. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom was significant not just for its immediate military consequences, but for what it revealed about Charlemagne's imperial vision. Unlike the barbarian kings who had preceded him, Charlemagne understood thought. Lasting power required more than military victory. He needed to create institutions that could govern diverse populations, laws that could maintain order across vast territories, and a culture that could unite peoples of different backgrounds under a common identity. The administrative system that Charlemagne developed to govern his expanding empire was a masterpiece of medieval statecraft. He divided his territory into counties, each governed by a count who served as both military commander and chief administrator. These counts were drawn from the ranks of the Frankish nobility, but they were also closely supervised by royal officials called missi dominici, who traveled throughout the empire to ensure that royal commands were being obeyed and that justice was being administered fairly. The legal system that emerged under Charlemagne's rule was equally innovative. Rather than imposing a single code of law on all his subjects, he allowed different peoples to maintain their traditional legal customs while creating royal courts that could hear appeals and resolve disputes between different communities. This system of legal pluralism was both practical and symbolic. It acknowledged diversity of the empire while asserting the ultimate authority of the emperor. Yet Charlemagne's greatest conquests were still to come. To the east of the Frankish kingdom lay the lands of the Saxons, a fierce Germanic people who had successfully resisted both Roman and Frankish expansion for centuries. The Saxons were not just political enemies. They were religious opponents who worshipped the old Germanic gods and actively resisted Christian missionary efforts. Their conquest would require not just military victory, but cultural transformation, the conversion of an entire people from paganism to Christianity. The Saxon Wars, which lasted from 772 to 804, were among the longest and most brutal conflicts of the early medieval period. The Saxons, led by their chief Wittermund, proved to be formidable opponents who used guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the local terrain to frustrate Frankish attempts at conquest. Time and again, Charlemagne's armies would defeat Saxon forces in open battle, only to find themselves facing renewed resistance as soon as they withdrew. The turning point came in 782, at the massacre of Verdun, where Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners who had been accused of rebellion. This act of terrible severity shocked even his own supporters, but had also demonstrated his absolute determination to complete the conquest of Saxony. The message was clear. Resistance to Frankish rule and Christian conversion was not just political, rebellion but a crime against God himself. The final submission of the Saxons came in 804, when Widukind himself accepted baptism and acknowledged Charlemagne as his overlord. The ceremony took place in the royal Kapelle at Aachen, where the Saxon chief knelt before the Frankish emperor and received the waters of baptism from the hands of Christian priests. It was a moment of profound symbolic importance. The last great pagan people of Central Europe had been brought into the Christian fold, and Charlemagne's Imperono extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ella River. But even as Charlemagne was completing his conquest of the Saxons, he was opening new fronts. In his endless campaign of expansion, to the south, across the Pyrenees, lay the Islamic kingdom of Al-Andalus, a sophisticated civilization that controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. The Muslims had been largely content to remain south of the mountains, but internal conflicts within their kingdom created opportunities for Frankish. The Spanish March, as historians would later call Charlemagne's campaigns in Spain, began in 778 with a massive expedition that aimed to establish Frankish control over the territories south of the Pyrenees. The campaign was only partially successful, but it established a pattern of expansion that would continue for Frankish forces gradually pushed southward, establishing fortified settlements and converting local populations to Christianity. The process was slow and often bloody, but it extended Charlemagne's authority deep into territories that had been under Islamic control for nearly a century. The most famous episode of the Spanish campaigns was the Battle of Roncevaux, where Charlemagne's rearguard was ambushed and destroyed by Basque forces as the Frankish army retreated from Spain. Among the dead was Roland, the emperor's nephew, whose heroic last stand would become the subject of one of the greatest epic poems of the medieval period. The Song of Roland, composed centuries later, transformed a minor military defeat into a glorious tale of Christian heroism and sacrifice, demonstrating how Charlemagne's reign was already becoming the stuff of legend. To the east, Charlemagne's forces were equally active, pushing into the lands of the Avars, a nomadic people who had established a powerful empire in the Danube basin. The Avar Wars, fought between 791 and 796, resulted in the complete destruction of the Avar kingdom and the capture of enormous quantities of gold and silver that had been accumulated over centuries of tribute collection. The wealth seized from the Avars funded Charlemagne's building projects and military campaigns for decades to come. The systematic expansion of Charlemagne's empire was accompanied by an equally systematic effort to spread Christianity throughout the conquered territories. The emperor understood that religious conversion was essential to political integration, that pagan peoples could never be fully trusted as subjects of a Christian empire. He established bishoprics in newly conquered territories, built churches and monasteries, and required all his subjects to accept baptism or face severe penalties. The Christianization of Charlemagne's empire was not just a matter of religious policy, but also a crucial element of cultural transformation. Christianity brought with it Latin literacy, Roman law, and the intellectual traditions of the ancient world. Pagan peoples who accepted Christian baptism were also accepting worship in a civilization that stretched back to the time of Christ himself. They were becoming part of a community that transcended tribal boundaries and national identities. The culmination of Charlemagne's career came on Christmas Day in the year 800, when Pope Leo III placed an image on his head in the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. The ceremony was carefully planned to evoke memories of the ancient Roman Empire while asserting the Christian character of the new imperial order. Charlemagne was not just another barbarian king. He was the successor to Augustus and Constantine. the ruler of a revived Roman Empire that would be both Christian and eternal. The imperial coronation was a moment of extraordinary symbolic power that resonated throughout medieval Europe. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a single ruler claimed authority over most of the former imperial territories. The empire that Charlemagne had created stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Elbe River, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, encompassing most of what would become modern France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. Yet, their new empire was fundamentally different from its Roman predecessor. Where Rome had been built on the foundation of urban civilization and imperial law, Charlemagne's empire was based on personal loyalty and Christian faith. Where Roman emperors had ruled through a professional bureaucracy, Charlemagne governed through a network of noble followers who owed him personal allegiance. Where Rome had been secular in its fundamental orientation, the Carolingian Empire was explicitly Christian in its identity and purpose. The court that Charlemagne established at Aachen became the center of a remarkable cultural renaissance that would transform medieval European civilization. The emperor gathered around him Thegriatist scholars of his age. Men like Alcuin of York, Einhard, and Rabanus Maruso worked to preserve and transmit the learning of the ancient world. The palace school at Aachen became a center of education that attracted students from across Europe, creating a network of learned men who would carry Caroline culture to the farthest corners of the empire. The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians would later call this cultural flowering, was characterized by a systematic effort to preserve and copy texts of classical antiquity. Scribes working in monastery asherat, the empire created thousands of manuscripts that preserved the works of ancient authors for future generations. They developed a new form of writing, Carolingian minuscule, that was clearer, more legible than previous scripts, making books more accessible to a wider audience. The intellectual achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance extended far beyond the mere preservation of ancient. Scholars at Charlemagne's court produced original works of theology, philosophy, and history that would influence European thought for centuries to come. They developed new approaches to education, created new forms of art and architecture, and established the foundations for the great cultural flowering that would characterize the High Middle Ages. The emperor himself, despite his limited formal education, was a patron of learning who understood the importance of intellectual culture to his imperial project. He collected books, commissioned works of art, and engaged in theological discussions with Thegriatist scholars of his age. His court became a place where ideas were exchanged, where different traditions were synthesized, where the intellectual foundations of medieval European civilization were laid. The palace complex at Aachen, which served as Charlemagne's primary residence, embodied the fusion of Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions that characterized his empire. The palace chapel, with its octagonal design and elaborate mosaics, was modeled on the Church of San Vital in Ravenna, connecting the new empire to the Byzantine tradition. The great hall, where the emperor held court and feasted with his followers, reflected Germanic customs of hospitality and warrior brotherhood. The library and scriptorium represented the Christian commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge. The daily life of Charlemagne's court was a carefully orchestrated blend of ceremony and informality that reflected the emperor's understanding of the requirements of effective leadership. He held formal audiences where he received ambassadors and heard petitions, but he also maintained the Germanic tradition of consulting with his warriors and sharing meals with his followers. He wore imperial regalia on state occasions, but also dressed simply and spoke in the vernacular language of his people. The administrative challenges of governing such a vast empire were enormous, requiring innovations in law, finance, and military organization that would influence European development for centuries. Charlemagne's legal reforms, codified in the Capitularies, established principles of justice that balanced Roman law with Germanic custom. His monetary reforms created a stable currency that facilitated trade throughout the empire. His military reforms established the foundations for the feudal system that would dominate medieval Europe. Yet, even as Charlemagne was creating the institutional foundations for his empire, he was also establishing the conditions for its eventual fragmentation. The Frankish tradition of dividing inheritance among all male heirs meant that the empire would be partitioned after his death, creating opportunities for civil war and territorial fragmentation. The personal nature of Carolingian authority meant that the empire's survival depended on the continued strength and ability of its rulers. The emperor's later years were marked by increasing concern about the future of his creation. He had outlived most of his sons, and his sole surviving heir, Louis the Pious, lacked the military skill and political acumen that had made his father's reign so successful. The old emperor spent his final years trying to ensure a smooth succession. But he could not prevent the forces of fragmentation that would tear his empire apart within a generation of his death. When Charlemagne died in 814, he was buried in the palace chapel at Aachen, surrounded by the treasures and regalia that symbolized his earthly power. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage for medieval emperors, who came to seek the blessing of the greatest ruler of the early medieval period. The empire he had created would not serve intact, but the memory of his achievements would inspire European rulers for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of Charlemagne's death seemed to confirm the durability of his imperial creation. His son, Louis the Pious, assumed the imperial throne without opposition and initially appeared capable of maintaining his father's legacy. The empire remained united. The administrative system continued to function, and the cultural renaissance showed no signs of decline. Yet, beneath the surface stability, forces were already at work that would transform the Carolingian Empire into something fundamentally different. The crisis that would reshape medieval Europe began with a conflict that seemed almost trivial, a dispute over the succession to the imperial throne. When Louis the Pious died in 850, his three serving sons each claimed a portion of the empire according to Frankish custom. What followed was a civil war that lasted for 3 years and ended with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided the empire into 3 separate kingdoms. The Treaty of Verdun was one of the most important documents in European history, creating the political framework that would shape the continent for centuries to come. The western portion of the empire, Francia Occidentals, went to Charles the Bald, and would eventually become the Kingdom of France. The eastern portion, Francia Orientalis, was assigned to Louis the German and would develop into the Holy Roman Empire. The middle kingdom, Francia was given to Lothair, and would gradually fragment into the various principalities of Italy, Burgundy, and Lotharingia. The division of Charlemagne's empire marked the end of the dream of a unified Christian Europe under a single ruler, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in medieval development. The 3 kingdoms that emerged from the Treaty of Verdun would each develop their own distinct character, their own institutions, and their own cultural traditions. The Western Kingdom in particular would evolve into something that Charlemagne could never have imagined, a truly French kingdom that would dominate in medieval Europe for centuries to come. The fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire was not merely a political catastrophe, but a fundamental transformation of European civilization. Its Where once a single will had commanded from the Atlantic to the Elbe, now 3 separate kingdoms emerged, each destined to follow its own path through the labyrinth of medieval history. Francia Occidentalis would become the crucible in which the French nation was forged, but this transformation would take centuries to complete and would be accomplished shed blood, betrayal, and the slow accumulation of royal power. Charles the Bald, who inherited the western portion of his grandfather's empire, faced challenges that would have overwhelmed a lesser ruler. His kingdom was a patchwork of competing authorities, where great nobles ruled their territories like independent princes, where Viking raiders struck at will along the coasts and rivers, where the very concept of central authority had been weakened by decades of civil war. The royal domain itself was pitifully small, consisting of little more than the area around Paris and a few scattered possessions elsewhere. Beyond these narrow boundaries, the king's authority was more theoretical than real, yet Charles the Bald possessed something that his enemies lacked: legitimacy. He was the anointed king, blessed by their church and recognized by the great nobles as their overlord. Even if they chose to ignore his commands, this legitimacy would prove to be a powerful weapon in the hands of his successors, who would use it to gradually expand royal authority over the course of centuries. The process would be slow and often violent, but it would ultimately transform a weak medieval kingdom into the most powerful state in Europe. The immediate threat to Charles's kingdom came not from rebellious nobles, but from the sea. The Vikings, vociferous warriors from the northern lands, had discovered that the rich monasteries and defenseless towns of Francia offered plunder beyond their wildest dreams. Their longships appeared without warning on the Seine, the Lier, and the Garonne, carrying death and destruction to communities that had known peace for generations. The raiders were not mere bandits, but skilled warriors who understood the art of war better than most of their victims. The first major Viking raid on the Frankish kingdom occurred in 845, when a fleet of 120 ships sailed up the Seine and attacked Paris itself. The city's defenses were woefully inadequate, and the Vikings captured it with ease, plundering the monasteries and churches before withdrawing with an enormous ransom. This humiliation demonstrated the kingdom's vulnerability and encouraged further raids that would continue for decades to come. The Viking threat was not just military but psychological. These pagan warriors seemed to strike at the very foundations of Christian civilization, burning churches, slaughtering priests, and carrying off sacred objects as common plunder. Their success undermined confidence in royal authority and forced local communities to organize their own defenses. Their assault was a further fragmentation of power, as nobles built castles and raised private armies to protect their lands when the king could not. Yet the Vikings were not the only threat facing the Western Kingdom. To the east, the descendants of Charlemagne's other sons were constantly probing for weaknesses, seeking to expand their own territories at their cousins' expense. To the south, the Muslims of Spain launched periodic raids across the Pyrenees, while to the north, the emerging kingdoms of England and Denmark pursued their own ambitions. The Western Kingdom was surrounded by enemies, and its survival was far from certain. The response to these multiple threats revealed both the weaknesses and the strengths of the post-Carolingian system. The weaknesses were obvious. The kingdom lacked the resources and organization necessary to defend its vast frontiers against multiple enemies. The royal army was small and poorly equipped. The treasury was nearly empty, and the administrative system was breaking down under the pressure of constant warfare. Many observers predicted that the kingdom would fragment into a collection of independent principalities, following the pattern that had already begun in the Eastern territories. But the kingdom also possessed hidden strengths that would become apparent only over time. The church remained a unifying force. It transcended local loyalties and provided a common identity for all Christians. The legal system, based on Carolingian precedents, continued to function even when royal authority was weak. Most importantly, the idea of kingship itself retained its power to inspire loyalty and legitimacy, and when individual kings were unable to enforce their will. The transformation of the Western Kingdom from a weak successor state to a powerful monarchy began with the gradual accumulation of royal power under a series of capable rulers. The process was neither linear nor inevitable, but it was persistent. Each generation of kings managed to expand royal authority a little further, bring a few more nobles under direct royal control to establish new sources of revenue and military strength. The kingdom that emerged from this long process would be fundamentally different from Charlemagne's empire, but it would also be more durable and more distinctly French. The key to this transformation was the development of new forms of political organization that were better suited to the realities of medieval society. The cathedralian system had been based on the assumption that a single ruler could effectively govern vast territories through personal charisma and administrative efficiency. When that assumption proved false, it became necessary to create new institutions that could function even when the king was weak or absent. The feudal system that emerged from the ruins of the Carolingian Empire was not a deliberate creation, but an organic response to the need for local security and governance. Great nobles, faced with the collapse of central authority, began to offer protection and land to lesser men in exchange for military service and personal loyalty. These relationships, formalized through ceremonies of homage and fealty, created a hierarchy of mutual obligations that extended from the king at the top to the humblest knight at the bottom. The feudal system has often been criticized as chaotic and inefficient, but it possessed certain advantages that made it well suited to the conditions of early medieval Europe. It was flexible enough to adapt to local conditions, strong enough to provide effective military defense, and personal enough to inspire genuine loyalty. Most importantly, it preserved the principle of hierarchy and authority, even when central government was weak, creating a framework within which royal power could eventually be rebuilt. The process of feudalization was gradualized, varied considerably, from region to region. In some areas, powerful nobles established virtual independence from royal authority, ruling their territories like sovereign princes. In others, the king managed to maintain more direct control, using a combination of military force, political manipulation, and religious sanction to keep the nobles in line. The result was a complex patchwork of competing authorities that would characterize medieval France for centuries to come. The Vikings, who had initially appeared as destroyers of civilization, gradually became part of the feudal system themselves. Some raiders settled permanently in the territories they had conquered, adopting Christianity and French customs, while maintaining their military traditions. The most successful of these settlements was established by a Norse chieftain named Rollo, who in 911 received a grant of land from Charles the Simple in exchange for defending the Seine Valley against other Viking raiders. The territory known as Normandy would become one of the most powerful duchies in medieval France and would eventually produce the conquerors of England. The integration of the Vikings into Frankish society was a remarkable example of medieval Europe's capacity for cultural adaptation. Within a few generations, the descendants of pagan raiders had become Christian knights, French speakers, and loyal vassals of the crown. They brought with them new military techniques, new forms of organization, and new perspectives on governance that enriched the developing French civilization. The process was not without conflict, but it demonstrated the ability of medieval society to transform enemies into allies through the power of shared institutions and common interests. The religious dimension of this transformation was crucial to its success. The Church provided not just spiritual guidance, but also practical assistance. The process of integration. Bishops and abbots served as mediators between different communities. Missionaries spread Christian teachings among pagan settlers, and monasteries provide education and administrative services that helped to create a common culture. The alliance between church and state that had been established under Charlemagne continued to function even when royal authority was weak, providing stability and continuity in an age of. The monastic movement in particular played a vital role in preserving and transmitting the cultural achievements of the Carolean Renaissance. Monasteries served as centers of learning, where ancient texts were copied and preserved, where new works of theology and philosophy were composed, where the skills of reading and writing were maintained during the darkest periods of the early Middle Ages. The great monastic center at Cluny, founded in 910, became the headquarters of a reform movement that spread throughout Europe and helped to revitalize the spiritual and intellectual life of the Church. The economic foundation of the emerging feudal system was agriculture. But it was agriculture organized along new lines that reflected the changed political circumstances. The great estates of the Carolingian period were gradually replaced by smaller holdings that could be more easily defended and administered. The manor, a self-contained agricultural unit that included the lord's residence, the peasant village, and the surrounding fields, became the basic unit of economic organization. This system provided security for the peasants and income for the nobles, while also creating the agricultural surplus that supported the warriors and priests who defended and governed medieval society. The peasants who worked these manors were not slaves in the classical sense, but they were not free either. They were bound to the land by various forms of legal obligation that limited their mobility and required them to provide labor services to their lords. This system of serfdom, as it came to be known, was often harsh and oppressive. But it also provided a measure of security and stability that was precious in an age of constant warfare and uncertainty. The peasants received protection from their lords, access to land for their own subsistence, and a place in the social hierarchy that, while humble, was nevertheless recognized and respected. The towns and cities that had flourished under Charlemagne's rule initially suffered greatly from the collapse of central authority and the disruption of trade networks. Many urban centers were abandoned or reduced to mere villages, their populations fleeing to the countryside in search of security. Yet, some cities managed to survive and even prosper by adapting to the new conditions. They've developed new forms of government, new economic activities, and new relationships with the rural nobility that surrounded them. The revival of urban life was closely connected to the gradual restoration of trade and commerce. As political conditions stabilized and new trade routes were established, merchants began to venture forth on seagoing, carrying goods between distant regions and creating the economic networks that would support the arc of medieval civilization. The fairs of Champagne, which began to develop in the 10th century, became the most important commercial centers in northern Europe, attracting merchants from as far away as Italy and Flanders. The cultural achievements of this period were less spectacular than those of the Carolingian Renaissance, but they were no less important for the long-term development of European civilization. the vernacular languages began to develop distinct literary traditions, with the first Shan Diast appearing in the 10th century. These epic poems, which celebrated the deeds of Charlemagne and his knights, helped to create a common cultural identity that transcended region. They also established the literary conventions that would influence European poetry for centuries to come. The artistic achievements of the period were equally significant, though they took different forms than those of the Carolingian age. Great stone churches that began to appear in the 10th century represented a new architectural style thought combined Carolian traditions with influences from Byzantium and these buildings, with their massive walls and small windows, were designed to be both fortresses and houses of worship, reflecting the military character of Theoge, while also expressing the spiritual aspirations of their builders. The intellectual life of the period was dominated by the schools that developed in connection with cathedrals and monasteries. These institutions trained the clergy who would serve as administrators, diplomats, and advisors to the great nobles. They also preserved and transmitted the learning of the ancient world, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of classical antiquity would not be lost during the centuries of political fragmentation. The curriculum of these schools was based on the 7 liberal arts, which provided a foundation for all higher learning and helped to create a common intellectual culture throughout Europe. The political evolution of the Western Kingdom during this period was marked by the gradual emergence of a new royal dynasty that would prove more successful than the later Carolians in rebuilding central authority. The last Carolingian king, Louis the Brave, died in 987 without male heirs, creating a succession crisis that would ultimately lead to the election of Hugh Cap as king. This moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in French history, one that would see the slow but steady expansion of royal power and the gradual creation of a unified French nation. Hugh Cap was not an obvious choice for the throne. He was the Duke of Francia, which gave him control over the area around Paris, but his territory was smaller than that of several other great nobles. He had no particular military reputation, no great wealth, and numerous dynastic claims to the throne. What he did have was the support of the Church, and the recognition that he was unlikely to threaten the independence of the other great nobles. His election was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that everyone could accept. The early Capetian kings ruled over a kingdom that was more theoretical than real. Their authority was recognized throughout the territory that had once belonged to Charles the Bald, but their ability to enforce that authority was limited to their own domains and those areas where they could find reliable allies. The great duchies of Normandy, Burgundy, and Aquitaine were virtually independent, their rulers acknowledging the king's supremacy in name while pursuing their own policies. In practice, the kingdom was a confederation rather than a unified state, held together by personal relationships and feudal obligations rather than institutional authority. Yet, the Capetian dynasty possessed certain advantages that would prove crucial to its long-term success. The principle of hereditary succession, which had been established by the later Carolingians, meant that each new king could claim the throne by right of birth rather than through election. This reduced the opportunities for succession disputes and gave the dynasty a stability that had been lacking in the later Carolian period. The Church, which had supported Hugh Cap's election, continued to provide legitimacy and practical assistance to his successors. Most importantly, the royal domain around Paris was strategically located, the heart of the kingdom, giving the Capetians control over the most important trade routes and communication networks The first Capetian kings were careful not to overreach. They concentrated on consolidating their control over their own domains, building up their military and financial resources, and establishing alliances with other nobles who shared their interests. They avoided costly foreign adventures and focused instead on the patient work of administration and diplomacy. This cautious approach was often criticized as timid, but it laid the foundations for the spectacular explosions of royal power that would occur in later centuries. The transformation of the Capetian kingdom from a weak, feudal confederation into a powerful centralized monarchy was one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval European history. It was accomplished not through sudden conquest, dramatic innovation, but through the steady accumulation of power over many generations. Each king managed to expand royal authority a little further, to bring a few more nobles under direct royal control, to establish new sources of revenue and military strength. The cumulative effect of these modest gains was revolutionary, transforming not just the Kingdom of France, but the entire balance of power in medieval Europe. The process was neither smooth nor there were periods of weakness and retreat, moments when it seemed that the kingdom might fragment once again into a collection of independent principalities. There were rebellions and civil wars, foreign invasions and internal betrayals. Yet, the Capetian dynasty proved remarkably resilient, surviving every crisis and emerging stronger from each trial. By the end of the 12th century, the Kingdom of France had become the most powerful state in Western Europe, a position it would maintain for centuries to come. The story of how this transformation was accomplished is one of the most fascinating chapters in medieval history, involving some of the most remarkable figures of the age. Kings like Louis VI the Fat and Louis VI laid the foundations for royal power through careful administration and strategic marriages. Philip Augustus would complete the work of centralization and establish France as dominant power in Europe. St. Louis would embody the highest ideals of medieval kingship while leading to catastrophic crusades. Philip the Fair would challenge the authority of the Pope himself and established the principle of royal sovereignty that would shape the modern world. But all of this lay in the future years. The 10th century drew to a close. The kingdom that Hugh Capet had inherited was weak and divided, threatened by enemies on all sides, and held together only by the slenderest of threads. Yet within this apparent weakness lay the seeds of future greatness, the potential for a transformation that would reshape not just France, but all of medieval Europe. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable stories in human history: the rise of medieval France from the ashes of Charlemagne's empire to become the greatest power of its age. The long night of the early Middle Ages was beginning to give way to the dawn of a new era. The foundations had been laid, the institutions had been established, and the forces that would shape the future were beginning to stir. The Kingdom of France was about to embark on its greatest adventure, a journey that would carry it from the mud of European civilization to the very center of medieval power and glory. The thousand-year journey toward French greatness began not with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but with the quiet accumulation of power in the hands of men who understood that true strength comes from patience, persistence, and the ability to see opportunity where they see only chaos. Hugh Capet, the first Capetian king, possessed none of obvious qualifications for greatness. He commanded no vast armies, controlled no enormous territories, and claimed no divine mandate for his rule. Yet, he possessed something far more valuable: the wisdom to recognize that in a world of competing ambitions and conflicting loyalties, survival belonged to those who could adapt, compromise, and endure. The kingdom that Hugh Capet inherited in 987 was a shadow of Charlemagne's mighty empire, a collection of territories held together by little more than shared memories and fading obligations. The great duchies that nominally acknowledged royal authority pursued their own policies with casual indifference to royal commands. The Duke of Normandy ruled his domain like an independent sovereign, maintaining his own diplomatic relations and waging his own wars without reference to the king in Paris. The Duke of Burgundy controlled territories that stretched from the heart of France to the borders of the German Empire, commanding resources that dwarfed those of the royal domain. The Duke of Aquitaine governed lands that extended from the Lyre to the Pyrenees, ruling over populations that spoke different languages and followed different customs. Yet Hugh Capet understood something that his more powerful contemporaries failed to grasp, that legitimacy was more valuable than strength, that the right to rule was more important than the ability to conquer. The crown that rested on his head carried with it the accumulated authority of centuries, the blessing of the church, and the recognition of his peers. These intangible assets could not be seized by force or purchased with gold, but they could be transmitted to his heirs and used to build something greater than any individual ruler could achieve alone. The early Capetian strategy was deceptively simple: consolidate control over their own domains, build alliances with neighboring nobles, and wait for opportunities to expand their influence. They avoided costly foreign adventures and concentrated instead on the patient work of administration and diplomacy. They strengthened their hold on the royal domain around Paris, improved the efficiency of their government, and cultivated their relationship with the church. Each small gain was carefully protected and used as the foundation for the next advance. The process was slow and often frustrating, but it was also remarkably effective. Within a few generations, the Capetian kings had transformed their modest inheritance into something approaching real power. They had extended their direct control over an ever-widening circle of territories, brought increasing numbers of under their authority, and established themselves as the undisputed leaders of French society. Their transformation was so gradual that it was barely noticed by contemporary observers, but its cumulative effect was revolutionary. The key to this transformation lay in the Capetian understanding of their changing nature of medieval society. The feudal system that had emerged from the ruins of the Carolingian Empire was not a static hierarchy, but a dynamic network of relationships that could be manipulated by those who understood its workings. The bonds of vassalage that connected lords and retainers were personal and emotional, as well as legal and economic. They could be strengthened through favors and rewards, weakened through neglect and abuse, and redirected through careful negotiation and strategic marriages. The Capetian kings became masters of this complex game, using their position at the apex of the feudal hierarchy to gradually expand their influence throughout the kingdom. They granted lands and titles to loyal supporters, arranged marriages that created new alliances, and intervened in succession disputes to ensure favorable outcomes. They used their control over the church to influence episcopal elections, their over legal proceedings to settle disputes in their favor, and their command of military resources to intimidate potential opponents. The transformation of the Capetian kingdom was not just political but cultural. As the royal court at Paris became a center of learning and sophistication that attracted scholars and artists from across Europe, the palace schools that had flourished under Charlemagne were revived and expanded, creating a new generation of administrators who could staff the growing royal bureaucracy. The great cathedral of Nram, whose construction began in the mid-12th century, became a symbol of both royal power and divine favor. Its soaring spires declaring to all who saw them that the Kingdom of France was blessed by God Himself. The economic foundations of the sculptural Renaissance were provided by the revival of trade and commerce that accompanied the restoration of political stability. The markets of Paris grew into the most important commercial centers in northern Europe, attracting merchants from Flanders, Italy, and even the distant lands of the East. The royal domain, strategically located at the intersection of the major trade routes, became a source of enormous wealth that funded the king's military campaigns and building projects. The prosperity that flowed from this commerce created a new class of wealthy townspeople who looked to the crown for protection and privilege. The military innovations that accompanied this economic growth were equally important to the expansion of royal power. The Capetian kings were among the first to recognize the potential of new military technologies and tactics, investing heavily in the development of siege engines, crossbows, and other weapons that could breach the walls of rebel castles. They also pioneered the use of mercenary troops, professional soldiers who owed their loyalty to whoever paid their wages, rather than to feudal lords who might have competing loyalties. These innovations gave the royal army a decisive advantage over traditional feudal levies and made resistance to royal authority increasingly futile. The diplomatic achievements of the early Capetian period were no less significant than the military ones. The kings of France established themselves as the leaders of Western Christendom, mediating disputes between other rulers and serving as the champions of church reform. They cultivated close relationships with the Pope, who came to see the French monarchy as the most reliable defender of ecclesiastic. They also established marriage alliances with other royal houses, creating a network of relationships that extended French influence far beyond the borders of the kingdom itself. The reign of Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, marked a crucial turning point in the development of Capetian power. Ascending to the throne in 1108, Louis inherited a kingdom that was still fragmented and contested, but it possessed the energy and determination to begin the work of true consolidation. His reign was marked by almost constant warfare as he campaigned against rebellious nobles, besieged rebel castles, and gradually extended royal authority throughout the domain. The king's personal courage and military skill earned him the respect of his warriors, while his commitment to justice and good governance won him the loyalty of his subjects. Louis the Fat's most significant achievement was the systematic reduction of the independent castles that had proliferated throughout the royal domain during the previous century. These fortifications, built by ambitious nobles who sought to carve out their own territories, had become centers of lawlessness and oppression that threatened both royal authority and public order. The king's campaigns against these castle builders were not merely military exercises, but moral crusades, efforts to restore peace and justice to territories that had been terrorized by petty tyrants. The siege warfare that characterized Louis's reign required new levels of organization and resources. Veterans formed the nature of royal government. The king had to maintain armies in the field for months at a time, transport heavy siege engines across difficult terrain, and coordinate the activities of multiple forces operating in different regions. These challenges forced the development of new administrative systems, new methods of taxation and supply, and new forms of military organization that would serve as the foundation for all future royal campaigns. The success of Louis the Fat's military campaigns was matched by equally important achievements in the realm of governance and law. The king established royal courts throughout his domain, appointed professional judges to hear cases and enforce royal decrees, and created a system of appeals that allowed his subjects to seek justice directly from the crown. These legal innovations were not merely administrative reforms, but fundamental changes in the relationship between ruler and subject, establishing the principle that the king was the ultimate source of justice, and that all his subjects had the right to appeal to him for redress of grievances. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Louis's reign were equally remarkable. The king patronized scholars and artists, supported the construction of new churches and monasteries, and encouraged the development of the Nantes University of Paris. The royal court became a center of learning that attracted students from across Europe, creating a new generation of educated administrators and advisors who would serve the crown for decades to come. The intellectual ferment of this period produced new forms of literature, new approaches to theology and philosophy, and new understandings of the role of government in society. The marriage of Louis's son and heir to Eléonine of Aquitaine in 1137 seemed to promise an even more dramatic expansion of royal power. Eléonine was the heiress to the vast Church of Aquitaine, which encompassed much of southwestern France and was one of the wealthiest and most cultured regions in Europe. The union of the Capetian domain with the Aquitanian inheritance would have created a kingdom that stretched from the English Channel to the Pyrenees, making France the undisputed master of Western Europe. Yet this marriage, which appeared to be a triumph for French diplomacy, would ultimately prove to be one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Capetian dynasty. The young Louis VII, who became King upon his father's death in 1137, was a pious and well-intentioned ruler, but he lacked the political skill and personal magnetism necessary to manage such a powerful and independent-minded wife. Eléonine was not content to play the role of a passive royal consort. She expected to be treated as a partner in government, and to have her opinions respected and her interests protected. The cultural differences between the northern French court and the sophisticated society of Aquitaine created additional tensions that proved impossible to resolve. Eléonine had been raised in a world of troubadours and courtly romance, where women enjoyed considerable freedom and influence. The austere religious atmosphere of the Capetian court, with its emphasis on duty and self-denial, was completely foreign to her temperament and inclinations. The inevitable conflicts that arose from these differences were exacerbated by the king's decision to join the Second Crusade, a disastrous expedition that kept him away from his kingdom for 2 years and accomplished nothing of lasting value. The failure of the Second Crusade was a personal and political catastrophe for Louis VII that undermined his authority and damaged his relationship with his wife. The king's military incompetence was exposed before the eyes of Europe. His financial resources were exhausted, and his absence from the kingdom allowed various nobles to pursue their own ambitions without royal interference. Eléonine, who had accompanied her husband on the crusade, was disgusted by his failures and increasingly alienate from a marriage that had brought her nothing but frustration and disappointment. The annulment of the marriage between Louis VI and Eléonine of Aquitaine in 1152 was a diplomatic disaster that would haunt the Capetian dynasty. For centuries, Eléonine immediately married Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, bringing her vast inheritance into the hands of a man who already controlled much of northern and western France. When Henry became King Henry II of England in 1154, He ruled over territories that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making him far more powerful than the King of France, whose nominal vassal he remained, the creation of the Angevin Empire, as historians would later call Henry II's vast collection of territories, fundamentally altered the balance of power in Western Europe and created a threat to French independence that would persist for centuries. The English kings, ruling over Landstadt, included much of what is now France, possessed resources that dwarfed those of the Capetian monarchy. They could raise larger armies, command greater wealth, and pursue more ambitious policies than their French. The feudal relationship that theoretically subordinated the English king to the French crown became increasingly meaningless as the reality of power shifted decisively in England's favour. The reign of Louis VI, which had begun with such promise, ended in apparent failure and humiliation. The king had lost his most valuable territories, seen his authority challenged by rebellious nobles, and failed to establish the kind of centralized government that his father had envisioned. Yet Louis's reign also laid important foundations for future success. His administrative reforms created more efficient systems of government. His legal innovations established important precedents for royal justice, and his cultural patronage contributed to the intellectual flowering that would characterize the next century of French history. The challenges that Louis VII faced were not unique to his reign, but reflected fundamental problems that would confront every medieval ruler. The tension between the personal nature of feudal relationships and the institutional requirements of effective government created contradictions that were difficult to resolve. The need to balance the demands of different social groups, to manage the competing interests of nobles and townspeople, and to maintain the loyalty of subjects who lived hundreds of miles from the royal court, required skills and resources that few rulers possessed. The transformation of medieval France from a collection of feudal territories into a unified nation was not the work of any single ruler, but the cumulative achievement of many generations. Each king contributed something to the process, whether through military conquest, administrative reform, cultural patronage, or diplomatic innovation. The failures were as important as the successes because they taught valuable lessons about the limits of royal power and the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. The intellectual and cultural develops of the 12th century created new possibilities for royal government that would be fully exploited by Louis VII's successors. The revival of Roman law provided new models for royal authority, while the growth of universities created a new class of educated administrators who could staff the expanding royal bureaucracy. The development of new forms of literature and art gave the monarchy new ways to communicate with its subjects and to project an image of power and legitimacy that transcended local loyalties. The economic changes that accompanied these cultural developments were equally important to the expansion of royal power. The growth of trade and commerce created new sources of wealth that could be tapped through taxation and regulation. The development of new technologies, from improved agricultural techniques to more efficient methods of production, increased the overall prosperity of the kingdom and provided the resources necessary for ambitious royal policies. The emergence of new social groups, particularly the wealthy merchants and craftsmen of the growing towns, created new constituencies that looked to the crown for protection and privilege. The military innovations of the period were perhaps the most important factor in the perpetual expansion of royal authority. The development of new weapons and tactics, from the crossbow to the siege engine, gave royal armies decisive advantage over traditional feudal levies. The emergence of professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than feudal obligation created military forces that were more reliable and more effective than the amateur warriors who had dominated earlier conflicts. The construction of new fortifications designed to take advantage of the latest military technologies gave the monarch strategic advantages that could be used to control rebellious territories. The diplomatic achievements of the 12th century were no less significant than the military ones. The French kings established themselves as the leaders of Western Christendom, mediating disputes between other rulers and serving as the champions of church reform. They cultivated relationships with the Pope, who came to see the French monarchy as the most reliable defender of ecclesiastical interests. They also established marriage alliances with other royal houses, creating networks of relationships that extended French influence far beyond the borders of the kingdom itself. The reign of Louis VI ended in 1180 with the accession of his son Philip Augustus, a young man who possessed all the qualities that his father had lacked. Philip was ambitious, ruthless, and politically astute, with an intuitive understanding of the requirements of effective kingship. He was also fortunate to come to the throne at a moment when the conditions were right for a dramatic expansion of royal power. The engine of an empire was beginning to show signs of strain. The church was entering a period of reform and renewal, and the growing prosperity of the kingdom provided the resources necessary for ambitious policies. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable reigns in French history. A quarter century of most constant warfare and political maneuvering that would transform the kingdom from a second-rate power into the dominant force in Western Europe. Philip Augustus would prove to be the greatest of the Capetian kings, the ruler who would finally realize the potential that had been building for his reign would witness the collapse of the Angevin Empire, the expansion of royal authority throughout France, and the establishment of the monarchy as the unquestioned leader of European politics. The young king who ascended the throne in 1180 inherited not just a kingdom, but a destiny. The patient work of his predecessors had created the conditions for greatness, and Philip Augustus possessed the vision and determination to seize the opportunity that history had presented. The next chapter in the story of medieval France would be written in blood and gold, in the clash of armies and the whispered negotiations of diplomatic conferences, in the construction of cathedrals, and the composition of epic poems that would celebrate the achievements of the greatest age in French history. The transformation that was about to begin would not be limited to France alone, but would reshape the entire balance of power in medieval Europe. The kingdom that had emerged from the ruins of Charlemagne's empire would finally claim its rightful place as the successor to Rome, the leader of Christian civilization and the model for all future European monarchies. The age of French greatness was about to dawn, and its light would illuminate the medieval world for centuries to come. The year 1180 marked not just a change of rulers, but the beginning of a revolution that would echo through the centuries. Philip Augustus, barely 15 years old when he assumed the throne, possessed something that had been absent from French kingship for generations. The cold calculation of a master strategist combined with the burning ambition of a conqueror, where his father, Louis VIII, had been pious and cautious. Philip was ruthless and opportunistic, where Louis had sought to preserve what he had inherited. Philip hungered to expand it beyond all recognition. The young king's first challenge came not from foreign enemies, but from within his own kingdom, where the great nobles had grown comfortable with royal weakness, and saw the accession of a teenage king as an opportunity to further erode central authority. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Burgundy, and most dangerously Henry II of England, all began to test their resolve of the new monarch. They probed his defenses, challenged his decisions, and waited for signs of the weakness that had characterized his father's reign. But Philip Augustus was not his father. When rebellious nobles thought they could manipulate the young king, they discovered a ruler who understood power in ways that would have shocked the pious Louis VII. Philip had studied the failures of his predecessors and learned from their mistakes. He knew that in a world where might mattered, survival depended not on moral authority, but on the ability to inspire fear in one's enemies and loyalty in one's followers. The royal court that Philip assembled around him reflected this new understanding of kingship. Gone were the scholarly debates and theological discussions that had characterized his father's reign. In their place came hard-headed administrators who understood that government was about results, not intentions. Men like Guillaume La Rochelle and Bartholdi Roy brought to the royal service a combination of practical experience and ruthless efficiency that would transform the machinery of French government. The king's first major test came in 1181, when Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders, attempted to dictate terms to the young monarch. The count had been regent during Philip's minority and apparently expected to continue wielding influence over royal policy's demands were breathtaking in their arrogance. He wanted control over key royal fortresses, the right to approve royal marriages, and effective veto power over major policy decisions. Any previous Capetian king might have negotiated, compromised, or sought to appease such a powerful noble. Philip Augustus chose war. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of medieval statecraft, demonstrating the young king's understanding that victory required more than military prowess. Philip carefully isolated the Count of Flanders, using a combination of bribes, threats, and diplomatic pressure to prevent other nobles from joining the rebellion. He cultivated relationships with the Count's own vassals, many of whom had grown weary of their lord's doinery. Most importantly, he moved with such speed and decisiveness that his enemies were caught off guard, unable to organize effective resistance. The Siege of Bèves in 1185 marked the definitive end of the Flemish rebellion, announced to Europe that a new kind of king ruled in France. Philip's forces surrounded the fortress with a professionalism that recalled the great campaigns of Charlemagne, using advanced siege techniques and coordinated attacks that overwhelmed the defenders. When the castle finally fell, Philip's treatment of the garrison was calculated to send a message: mercy for those who submitted quickly, but destruction for those who resisted royal authority. The victory over Flanders was significant, not just for its immediate military consequences, but for what it revealed about Philip's approach to kingship. Unlike his predecessors, who had often been content to accept nominal submission from rebellious nobles, Philip insisted on real obedience, backed by practical guarantees. He demanded hostages from defeated enemies, required them to surrender key fortresses, and imposed financial penalties that would prevent future rebellion. The feudal system that had protected noble independence for centuries was being transformed into an instrument of royal control. The administrative reforms that Philip implemented during his early reign were equally revolutionary. The king understood that lasting power required more than military victory. It demanded the creation of institutional structures that could function effectively even when the monarch was absent or distracted. He established a new class of royal officials called bailiffs, professional administrators who were responsible directly to the crown rather than to local nobles. These men, drawn from the emerging class of university-educated clerics and lawyers, brought to royal service a level of competence and loyalty that had been impossible under old feudal system. The financial innovations of Philip's reign were perhaps even more important than the administrative ones. The king recognized that the economic changes transforming European society had created new opportunities for royal taxation that his predecessors had failed to exploit. The growth of trade and commerce had created new forms of wealth that could be taxed more efficiently than traditional agricultural production. The emergence of a money economy had made it possible to maintain professional armies and bureaucracies that were far more effective than the feudal levies of earlier generations. The royal treasury that Philip built during his reign became one of the most important instruments of his policy. Unlike his predecessors, who had often been forced to rely on the generosity of their nobles for financing major kings, Philip possessed independent sources of revenue that gave him unprecedented freedom of action. Heckled hire mercenaries when feudal levies proved inadequate, purchased the loyalty of potential allies, and undertake building projects that enhance both royal prestige and practical power. The cultural transformation of the French court under Philip Augustus was no less significant than the political and administrative changes. The king understood that power in medieval society was as much about perception as reality, that the Abilitato project, an image of strength and legitimacy, was crucial to maintaining authority. He invested heavily in the construction of new royal palaces, the patronage of scholars and artists, and the development of court ceremonies that emphasize the sacred nature of royal authority. The fortress of the Louvre, which Philip began constructing in 1190, exemplified this new approach to royal power. The massive stone structure was designed not just as a military stronghold, but as a symbol of royal authority that could be seen from across the city of Paris. Its towers rose above the surrounding buildings like stone proclamations of royal supremacy, while its walls enclosed treasuries and armories that demonstrated the king's practical resources. The fortress was both functional and symbolic, serving the dual purpose of protecting the royal person and projecting royal power. The expansion of Paris under Philip's rule reflected broader changes in the nature of medieval government. The city grew from a modest town clustered around the royal land to a major European metropolis that rivaled Rome and Constantinople in size and importance. The king's investments in urban infrastructure, from new bridges and roads to improved water supplies and market facilities, transformed Paris into a magnet for merchants, scholars, and craftsmen from across Europe. The prosperity that resulted from this growth provided the crown with new sources of revenue and political support. The University of Paris, which received royal charter and protection during Philip's reign, became one of the most important centers of learning in medieval Europe. The king understood that intellectual quotient was as important as military victory in establishing the prestige of his kingdom. He attracted scholars from across Christendom, providing them with the resources and protection necessary for their work. The theological and philosophical innovations that emerged from the university helped to establish France as intellectual leader of medieval Europe. The military innovations of Philip's reign were equally significant. The king was among the first European rulers to understand the implications of new military technologies for the conduct of warfare. He invested heavily in the development of siege engines, crossbows, and other weapons that could breach the walls of enemy fortresses. He also pioneered new tactical approaches that emphasized coordination between different types of forces and the systematic reduction of enemy strongholds, rather than the dramatic but often inconclusive battles that had characterized earlier conflicts. The professional army that Philip created during his reign was fundamentally different from the feudal levies that had dominated medieval warfare for centuries. These men fought for pay rather than feudal obligation, served for rather than the traditional 40 days, and were trained in the latest military techniques rather than relying on individual prowess. The result was a military force that was more reliable, more effective, and more directly under royal control than anything that had existed in medieval Europe. The diplomatic achievements of Philip's early reign were no less impressive than his military and administrative exploits. The king understood that the complex web of relationships that connected medieval European rulers required careful management and constant attention. He cultivated alliances with rulers who shared his interests, exploited the rivalries between his enemies, and used a combination of marriage negotiations, trade agreements, and military threats to advance friendship. Across the continent, the relationship between Philip Augustus and the Angevin Empire that controlled much of what is now France was the defining challenge of his reign. Henry II of England, who ruled over territories that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, possessed resources that dwarfed those of the French crown. Yet Philip understood that the very size of the Angevin Empire was also its greatest weakness. The territories were scattered, the populations were diverse, and the administrative challenges were enormous. A patient and skillful opponent could exploit these vulnerabilities to bring down even the mightiest empire. The death of Henry II in 1189 and the succession of his son Richard the Lionheart created new opportunities for French policy. Richard was a magnificent warrior, but a poor administrator, more interested in crusading adventures than in the careful management of his vast inheritance. His prolonged absence from his territories during the Third Crusade left them vulnerable to the kind of systematic pressure that Philip Augustus was uniquely qualified to apply. The Third Crusade, which began in 1189, was ostensibly a joint enterprise between the kings of France and England. But it quickly became a competition between two very different approaches. Richard embodied the romantic ideals of medieval chivalry, leading his armies with personal courage and inspiring his followers through dramatic gestures and heroic deeds. Philip represented a more calculating approach to power, viewing the Crusade an opportunity to advance French interests rather than as a spiritual advent. The contrast between the two kings was evident from the moment they arrived in Holy Land. Richard threw himself into the fighting with characteristic enthusiasm, winning spectacle victories, but exhausting his resources and alienating potentialities. Through his high-handed behavior, Philip conducted a more measured campaign, achieving his military objectives while carefully husbanding his strength for the longer struggle thought he knew awaited him in Europe. The decision by Philip Augustus to return to France in 1191, ostensibly for reasons of health, but actually to take advantage of Richard's absence, marked a turning point in the struggle between the two kingdoms. While Richard continued his crusading adventures, Philip began the systematic conquest of the Angevin territories. The king's strategy was not to engage in dramatic battles, but to capture fortresses, win over local populations, and gradually erode the foundations of English power. The fortress of Geyser, which guarded the frontier between the French royal domain and the English territories in Normandy, became the symbol of this new phase of the Philip's siege of the castle in 1193 demonstrated his mastery of the latest military techniques and his understanding of the psychological dins of warfare. The systematic reduction of the fortress, conducted with methodical precision over many months, sent a clear message to other English strongholds about the futility of resistance. The return of Richard from the Crusade in 1194 led to 5 years of intense warfare that would determine the future of medieval Europe. The conflict that ensued was not the romantic struggle of chivalric literature, but a brutal contest of resources. will and strategic intelligence, both kings understood that the stakes were enormous. The winner would dominate Western Europe for generations to come, while the loser would be reduced to the status of amana power. The campaigns of the 1190s revealed Philip Augustus at the height of his powers, demonstrating the military and political skills that would make him one of the greatest rulers in medieval history. He combined the tactical brilliance of a great general with the strategic patience of a master politician, understanding that lasting victory required more than success in individual battles. His systematic approach to warfare, his careful attention to logistics and supply, and his ability to maintain the loyalty of his followers through extended campaigns, marked him as a commander of exceptional ability. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199, killed by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in the Limoux, removed Philip's most dangerous opponent and created opportunities that the French king was quick to exploit. Richard's brother John, who inherited the Angevin territories, lacked both the military skill and the political acumen of his predecessor. He was suspicious, cruel, and incompetent, alienating his own nobles and providing Philip with the allies he needed to complete the conquest of the English territories in France. The trial of John Lackland before the French royal court in 1202 was a masterpiece of medieval political theatre that demonstrated Philip's understanding of the power of medieval society by summoning John to answer charges of violating his feudal obligations. Philip was asserting the principle that even the King of England was subject to French law when it came to his continental territories. John's refusal to appear before the court provided Philip with the legal justification he needed to declare the English thieves forfeit and to begin their systematic conquest. The campaign that followed was the culmination of Philip's life work, the final act in the drama that had begun with his accession to the throne 22 years earlier. The systematic reduction of English strongholds across northern France demonstrated the effectiveness of the military and administrative systems that Philip had spent decades perfecting. Castle after castle fell to French forces, their garrisons unable to resist combination of superior siege techniques and political pressure that Philip brought to bear. The siege of Chatgaia in 1203. 124 became a symbol of English defeat and French triumph. The great fortress built by Richard the Lionheart to guard the approaches to Rouen was considered impregnable by contemporary military experts. Yet Philip's forces, using a combination of direct assault, siege engines, and psychological warfare, managed to breach its defences after a siege of 8 months. The fall of Chateau Gaillard opened the way to Rouen and the conquest of Normandy, the heartland of the Angevin Empire. The capture of Rouen in 1204 marked the effective end of English power in northern France and the beginning of a new era in European politics. The city that had been the capital of the Norman dukes for centuries now acknowledged the sovereignty of the French crown. The territories that had been lost through the marriage of Ellalinina of Aquitaine were finally restored to royal control. The Angevin Empire, which had seemed so formidable just a few years earlier, had collapsed like a house of cards. Their transformation of Philip Augustus from a teenage king ruling over a modest domain to the master of the greatest kingdom in Western Europe was complete. In less than a quarter century, he had tripled the size of the royal domain, established French supremacy over the English territories in France, and created the institutional foundations for centuries of French dominance. The kingdom that had been a second-rate power when he ascended the throne was now the undisputed leader of European politics. Yet, Philip's greatest triumph was still to come. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 would bait a culmination of his reign, the moment when all his carefully laid plans would come together in a single decisive encounter that would determine the fate of medieval Europe. The alliance that had formed against him, including the Holy Roman Emperor, the Count of Flanders, and King John of England, represented the greatest threat that any French king had ever faced. The outcome of the battle would determine not just the fate of the participants, but the future of European civilization itself. The stage was set for one of the battles in medieval history, a conflict that would test everything that Philip Augustus had built during his remarkable reign. The patient work of decades, the careful accumulation, the systematic development of new forms of government and warfare, all would be put to the ultimate test on Zeppelins of Flanders. The fate of France, and perhaps of medieval Europe itself, would be decided. A single afternoon of combat that would echo through the centuries. The sun rose on July the 27th, 1214, over fields that would soon be consecrated with the blood of kings and peasants alike. At Bouvines, a small village in Flanders whose name would echo through eternity. Two visions of Europe's future prepared to collide with the force of destiny itself. On one side stood Philip Augustus, the architect of French greatness, surrounded by the flower of French chivalry and the disciplined ranks of royal infantry. On the other gathered the greatest coalition ever assembled against a single ruler, Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, supported by the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Brabant, and the Earl of Salisbury, representing his master, King John of England. The coalition that faced Philip Augustus that morning represented more than mere political opposition. It embodied the old order's desperate attempt to prevent the emergence of a new kind of European. The Holy Roman Emperor still dreamed of recreating Charlemagne's empire, of ruling over a unified Christendom from his throne in Germany. The Flemish nobles sought to maintain their independence from royal authority, to preserve the feudal fragmentation that had protected their privileges for centuries. The English fought to reclaim territories they had lost through their own incompetence, to restore an empire that had been built on luck and marriage rather than genuine strength. Yet, as the armies deployed across the plain of Bouvines, it became clear that this was no ordinary medieval battle. The forces that Philip Augustus had assembled represented something unprecedented in European warfare, a truly national army that combined the traditional feudal levy with professional soldiers, urban militias, and foreign mercenaries. The king's banners flew over men who spoke different languages and followed different customs, but who were united by a common loyalty to the crown that had given them protection, justice, and prosperity. The French battle line that formed on that fateful morning was a testament to Philip's genius for organization and his understanding of the changing nature of medieval warfare. In the center, the king himself commanded the heavy cavalry, the mailed knights whose ancestors had conquered all of Europe under Charlemagne. To their left and right stood the infantry formations, disciplined ranks of spearmen and crossbowmen, who had learned their trade in the systematic sieges of English castles. Behind them waited the reserves, fresh troops who could be thrown into the battle at the crucial moment to tip Thebulans toward victory. The battle itself unfolded with the terrible inevitability of Greek tragedy. The imperial forces, confident in their numerical superiority and the righteousness of their cause, launched a series of massive cavalry charges that sought to break the French line through sheer force and determination. The thundering hooves of thousands of war horses shook the earth, while the war cries of a dozen different peplars echoed across the battlefield. Steel met steel with a crash that could be heard for miles, and for a moment it seemed that the weight of numbers might carry the day for the coalition, but Philip Augustus had not spent 24 years building his kingdom only to see it destroyed in a single afternoon. The French line bent but did not break, absorbing the shock of the imperial charge while maintaining its cohesion and discipline. The crossbowmen, protected by the shields of their comrades, sent volley after volley into the ranks of the enemy cavalry, while the spearman held firm against the pressure of the mounted knights, decking himself, fighting in the front rank like a common soldier, inspired his men through personal example and shared a danger. The turning point came when Philip's reserves, held back through hours of desperate fighting, finalized battle at the moment when the enemy forces were exhausted and disorganized. The fresh French troops struck the flanks of the imperial army like a thunderbolt, rolling up the enemy line and transforming what had been a closely contested battle into a rout. The Count of Flanders was captured. The Duke of Brabant fled the field, and the Holy Roman Emperor himself barely escaped with his life. The victory at Bouvines was more than a military triumph. It was a vindication of everything that Philip Augustus had worked to achieve during his reign. The feudal fragmentation that had characterized medieval Europe for centuries had been decisively defeated by a new form of royal authority that combined personal leadership with institutional power. The old dream of imperial unity leadership had been shattered, replaced by a new reality of French dominance that would shape European politics for generations to come. The immediate consequences of the battle were felt throughout Europe. In England, King John's defeat discredited his rule and led directly to the rebellion that would force him to sign Magna Carta the following year. In Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor's authority was fatally weakened, beginning the long decline that would eventually reduce the empire to a collection of competing principalities. In France, Philip Augustus returned to Paris as the undisputed master of Western Europe, his authority enhanced by a victory that seemed to prove definitive for his cause. Yet the deeper significance of Bouvines lay not in its immediate political consequences, but in what it revealed about the transformation of medieval civilization. The battle marked the end of the age of feudal fragmentation and the beginning of the era of national monarchies that would dominate European politics until the modern period. It demonstrated that the future belonged in it to those who clung to ancient privileges and traditional authorities, but to those who could adapt to change and circumstance and create new forms of organization. The France that emerged from the Bouvines was fundamentally different from the kingdom that Hugh Capet had inherited 2 centuries earlier, whereas the royal domain had been a modest collection of territories around Paris. Now it stretched from the English Channel to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Alps, where one seath king had been little more than a feudal overlord, dependent on the goodwill of his nobles. Now he commanded resources and wielded authority that rivaled those of the Roman emperors. The administrative system that Philip Augustus had created to govern his expanded kingdom became the model for royal government throughout Europe. The bailiffs who administered justice in the king's name, the professional soldiers who fought in his armies, the scholars who staffed his bureaucracy, all represented new forms of organization that were more efficient and more reliable than the feudal institutions they replaced. The legal system that guaranteed royal justice to all subjects, regardless of their social status, created a new relationship between ruler and ruled that would influence political development for centuries to come. The economic transformation that accompanied Philip's political achievements was equally significant. The kingdom that had been primarily agricultural was becoming increasingly commercial, with towns and cities growing at an unprecedented rate. The royal domain, strategically located at the intersection of Europe's major trade routes, became a source of enormous wealth that funded the crown's military campaigns and building projects. The prosperity that resulted from political stability and royal protection created a new class of wealthy merchants and craftsmen, who looked to the monarchy for leadership and guidance. The cultural renaissance that flourished under Philip's patronage established France as the intellectual center of medieval Europe. The University of Paris became the most important center of learning in the Christian world, attracting students from across the continent who came to study theology, philosophy, and law. The Gothic cathedrals that rose in cities throughout the kingdom represented not just architectural achievement, but spiritual aspiration. Monuments to a civilization that had achieved unprecedented heights of artistic and the military innovations that had made Philip's victories possible continued to evolve through Thuthu's reign, creating new forms of warfare that would influence military development for centuries. The systematic use of siege engines, the coordination of different types of forces, the development of professional armies, all represented advances that gave medieval warfare a new level of sophistication and effectiveness. The fortress building program that Philip initiated created a network of royal strongholds that could control rebellious territories and defend against foreign invasion. The diplomatic achievements of Philip's reign were no less impressive than his military conquests. The king established France as the leader of European politics, mediating disputes between other rulers and serving as the champion of Christian civilization. His marriage alliance created networks of relationships that extended French influence far beyond the borders of the kingdom itself, while his diplomatic interventions shaped the course of European development in ways that would persist for generations. The death of Philip Augustus in 1223 marked the end of an era, but not the end of the transformation he had begun. His son Louis VIII, though he reigned for only 3 years, continued his father's policies and extended royal authority even further. The systematic conquest of Albigensian territories in southern France brought the entire Mediterranean coast under royal control, while the establishment of new administrative systems ensured that these conquests would be permanent rather than the reign of Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, would represent the culmination of the medieval French monarchy's achievements. The king who ruled from 1226 to 1270 embodied the highest ideals of medieval kingship while commanding resources and wielding authority that made him the most powerful ruler in Europe. His two crusades, though military failures, enhanced France's prestige as the leader of Christian civilization, while his domestic policies created a model of royal government that would influence European development for centuries. The legal reforms that Louis IX implemented during his reign established principles of justice that would survive the collapse of the medieval world itself. The royal courts that he created provided a forum for settling disputes that transcended local loyalties and feudal obligations, while his legal codes established uniform standards of justice that applied to all subjects, regardless of their social status. The administrative innovations that he introduced created a more efficient and more responsive system of government that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential continuity. The economic policies of Louis IX's reign reflected his understanding that royal authority required material foundations as well as spiritual legitimacy. The king's regulation of trade and commerce created stable conditions for economic growth, while his moneta reforms established a currency system that facilitated exchange throughout the kingdom. The urban development that encouraged created new centers of wealth and population that supported the expanding royal government while providing opportunities for social mobility. The cultural achievements of Louis IX's reign were equally remarkable. The king's patronage of learning in the arts created a flowering of intellectual and artistic activity that established France as the cultural centre of medieval Europe. The Sainte-Chapelle-Builto house, the crown of thorns, and other sacred relics became a symbol of royal piety and artistic achievement that inspired imitation throughout the Christian world. The scholarly activity that flourished under royal protection produced new forms of theological and philosophical thought that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. The military campaigns that Louis Vanim conducted during his reign demonstrated both the power and the limitations of medieval French monarchy. The King's Crusades, though they ended in failure and death, revealed the extraordinary resources that the French crown could mobilize for distant campaigns. The domestic conflicts that he resolved through negotiation and compromise showed his understanding that lasting peace required more than military victory. The fortress-building program that he continued created a defensive network that would protect the kingdom against foreign invasion for generations. The reign of Philip III, who succeeded his father in 1270, marked the beginning of a new phase in French royal development. The king who ruled until 1285 inherited a kingdom that had reached the height of its medieval power. But he also faced new challenges that would test the institutional foundations that his predecessors had created. The Aragonese Crusade, launched at papal request, demonstrated the dangers of allowing religious obligations to override political calculations. While the continuing conflicts with English possessions in southwestern France revealed the persistent nature of territorial disputes, the transformation of medieval France from a collection of feudal territories into a unified nation was not complete with the death of Philip III. But the essential foundations had been laid. The institutional structures that had been created during the preceding centuries would prove strong enough to survive the challenges of the 14th century, including the disasters of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death. The cultural and intellectual achievements of the medieval period would provide inspiration and guidance for future generations of French leaders. The story of medieval France's rise to greatness was not just the story of individual rulers and their achievements, but the story of a civilization that had learned to balance competing demands and reconcile conflicting interests. The feudal system that had emerged from the ruins of Charlemagne's empire had been transformed into something new, and a national monarchy that combined personal leadership with institutional authority, military power with cultural achievement, territorial expansion with administrative efficiency. The legacy of medieval France would extend far beyond the borders of the kingdom itself, influencing the development of European civilization in ways that would persist long after the medieval period had ended. The legal principles that had been established during the reign of Philip Augustus and his successors would provide the foundation for modern European law, while the administrative innovations that had been developed to govern the expanding kingdom would influence governmental development throughout the continent. The cultural achievements of medieval France would prove equally enduring. The Gothic cathedrals that rose during the 12th and 13th centuries would inspire architectural development for centuries to come, while the intellectual traditions that flourished at the University of Paris would influence European thought throughout the modern period. The literary traditions that emerged during the medieval period would provide the foundation for French cultural identity, while the artistic innovations that were developed under royal patronage would influence European art for generations. The military innovations that had made French victories possible would continue to evolve throughout the medieval period. Creating new forms of warfare thought would influence military development for centuries. The systematic use of siege engines, the coordination of different types of forces, the development of professional armies, all represented advances that would be copied and adapted by other European powers. The fortress-building programs that had been initiated during the reign of Philip Augustus would continue to shape the strategic landscape of Europe for generations to come. The diplomatic achievements of medieval France would establish patterns of international relations that would influence European politics for centuries. The marriage alliances that had been negotiated thanks and French influence would create networks of relationships that would shape European development long after the medieval period had ended. The diplomatic innovations that had been developed to manage complex international relationships would provide models for future European diplomacy. As the 13th century drew to a close, the kingdom that had emerged from the patient work of the Capetian dynasty stood as the greatest power in medieval Europe. The transformation that had begun with Wapi's election in 987 had created something unprecedented in European history. A unified nation that combined territorial extent with administrative authority, military power with cultural achievement, royal authority with popular loyalty. The France that would enter the 14th century was ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that it had created institutions and traditions that will endure for centuries to come. The foundations of French greatness had been laid through the accumulated efforts of generations of rulers who had understood that lasting power required more than military conquest or political manipulation. It demanded the creation of institutions that could survive individual rulers, traditions that could inspire popular loyalty, and achievements that could command international respect. The medieval French monarchy had succeeded in creating all of these things, establishing a legacy that would influence European development for centuries to come. The story of medieval France's rise to greatness was far from over as the 13th century ended, but the essential chapters had been written. The kingdom that would face the challenges of the 14th century possessed the institutional strength, cultural vitality, and popular support necessary to overcome whatever obstacles might arise. The patient work of the Capetian dynasty had created something that would endure. A French nation that would play a central role in European civilization for centuries to come. The golden age that had been centuries in the making was about to face its greatest test as the 14th century dawned. The kingdom that Philip Augustus had forged and Louis IX had sanctified stood at the pinnacle of European power. Yet beneath the surface of this magnificent achievement, forces were stirring that would challenge everything the Capetian dynasty had built. The very success of the French monarchy had created new problems that traditional solutions could not address, while the changing nature of European society was generating pressures that would test the limits of medieval institutions. Philip IV, known to history as Philip Fair, ascended to the throne in 1285, with all the confidence of a ruler who inherited the greatest kingdom in Christendom. Tall, handsome, and possessed of an almost supernatural charisma, he seemed the perfect embodiment of royal authority. Yet beneath his impressive exterior lay a mind that was both brilliant and dangerous, capable of innovations that would revolutionize European politics, while simultaneously undermining the very foundations of medieval civilization. His reign would witness triumphs that surpassed even those of his illustrious predecessors, but it would also see the beginning of conflicts that would haunt France for generations to come. The first sign of the challenges that lay ahead came in Philip's confrontation with Pope Boniface V, a conflict that would fundamentally alter the relationship between secular and spiritual authority in medieval Europe. The dispute began over the seemingly mundane issue of taxation of the clergy. But it quickly escalated into a battle for supremacy that would determine whether the future belonged to national monarchies or to the universal church. When Boniface issued the bull Unam Sanctum, declaring that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation, Philip's response was swift and devastating. His agents seized the Pope and Nani, subjecting the Holy Father to treatment that shocked the Christian world and demonstrated that even Thevisa of Christ was not beyond the reach of royal power. The humiliation of Boniface VIII marked the end of an era in European politics. For centuries, the Pope had been the ultimate arbiter of disputes between Christian rulers, the guardian of moral authority that transcended national boundaries. Now, suddenly, that authority had been challenged successfully by a secular monarch who claimed that his kingdom's interests took precedence over universal Christian unity. The implications of this victory would reverberate throughout the medieval world as other rulers recognized that the balance of power between church and state had shifted decisively in favor of royal authority. The transfer of the papal court to Avignon in 1309 completed Philip's triumph over the church, creating what contemporaries called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. For nearly 70 years, the successors of St. Peter would reside not in Rome but in a French city, surrounded by French influences and subject to French pressure. The papacy that had once claimed dominion over all Christian rulers was now effectively a department of the French royal government, its policies shaped by the needs of the French monarchy rather than the spiritual welfare of universal Christendom. Yet, even as Philip the Fair was achieving these spectacular victories over his enemies, he was also creating new problems that would plague his successors for generations. The expansion of royal authority that had made France the greatest power in Europe had also created a government system of unprecedented complexity and expense. The bureaucracy that administered the kingdom required enormous resources. The professional army that defended it demanded constant funding, and the ambitious building projects that proclaimed royal greatness consumed vast amounts of treasure that the traditional sources of royal revenue could no longer provide. The financial crisis that emerged during Philip's reign was not merely a temporary difficulty, but a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of medieval monarchy. The feudal system that had sustained royal government for centuries was breaking down under the pressure of new military technologies, new forms of economic organization, and new concepts of political authority. The king could no longer rely on the traditional feudal levy to defend his kingdom, but the professional armies that had replaced it were far more expensive than the royal treasury could sustain. The result was a constant search for new sources of revenue that would eventually lead to conflicts with the very subjects whose loyalty had made French greatness possible. The solution that Philip and his advisors devised was as innovative as it was dangerous. They would create new forms of taxation that could tap the growing wealth of French society while simultaneously expanding royal authority into areas that had traditionally been beyond governmental control. The result was a series of financial innovations that included the systematic taxation of the clergy, the manipulation of the currency, and the establishment of new commercial regulations that generated revenue while asserting royal control over economic activity. The most notorious of these innovations was the destruction of the Knights Templar, the military order that had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. The Templars' combination of military prowess, financial resources, and international connections had made them virtually independent of royal authority, a situation that Philip found intolerable. The charges of heresy and corruption that he brought against the order were almost certainly fabricated, but they provided the legal justification. necessary to seize the Templars' vast wealth and eliminate a potential threat to royal supremacy. The trial of the Templars, which began in 1307, was a masterpiece of judicial manipulation that demonstrated Philip's understanding of the power of propaganda and legal procedure. The confessions extract through torture, the dramatic public ceremonies, and the systematic destruction of the order's records served to convince contemporary observers that the knights had indeed been guilty of the crimes charged against them. The burning of Jock de Mole, the last Grand Master, in 1314 marked the end of an institution that had symbolized the international character of medieval Christianity and the beginning of a new era in which national interests would take precedence over universal obligations. The wealth seized from the Templars provided temporary relief from the crown's financial difficulties, but it also set a dangerous precedent that would be followed by Philip's successors. The royal government had demonstrated that it possessed the power to destroy even the most powerful institutions when they conflicted with royal interests. But it had also shown that this power could be used for purely financial purposes rather than legitimate governmental objectives. The result was a climate of fear and uncertainty that would undermine fealty and confidence that had been the foundation of Capetian success. The administrative innovations of Philip's reign were equally revolutionary and equally problematic. The king's expansion of royal bureaucracy created a governmental system that was more efficient and more responsive than anything that had existed in medieval Europe. But it also created new forms of corruption and abuse that alienated the very subjects it was designed to serve. The royal officials who administered justice in the king's name often pursued their own interests rather than those of the crown, while the legal procedures that were supposed to guarantee fair treatment became instruments of oppression and exploitation. The economic policies that Philip implemented during his reign reflected his understanding that royal authority required material foundations, but they also demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice long-term stability for short-term advantage. The manipulation of the currency that he used to finance his military campaigns created inflation and economic uncertainty that damaged the prosperity of his subjects, while the commercial regulations that he imposed to generate revenue often hindered rather than helped the economic development that was essential to the kingdom's continued growth. The military achievements of Philip's reign were impressive by any standard, but they also revealed the limitations of the system that he had inherited from his predecessors. The conquest of Flanders demonstrated the power of French arms, but it also showed the enormous cost of maintaining professional armies in the field for extended periods. The campaigns against the English possessions in southwestern France were successful in expanding royal territory, but they also created new defensive obligations that would strain royal resources for generations to come. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Philip's reign were equally ambiguous. The king's patronage of learning and the arts created a flowering of intellectual activity that enhanced France's reputation as the cultural center of Europe. But it also created new forms of thought that would ultimately challenge the foundations of royal authority. Fellow and scholars who served the crown developed new theories of government that emphasized the power of secular rulers. But they also created intellectual frameworks that could be used to justify resistance to royal oppression. The death of Philip the Fair in 1314 marked the end of the greatest period of expansion in French royal history. Boutic also marked the beginning of a new era of challenges that would test everything the Capetian dynasty had built. The three sons who succeeded him in rapid succession would each face crises that revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the system of government that Philip had created. Louis Vex, Philip V, and Charles IV would all struggle with the financial difficulties their father had bequeathed to them, while also confronting new forms of opposition that challenged the very legitimacy of royal authority. The succession crisis that erupted with the death of Charles IV in 1328 would bring the Capuchin dynasty to an end and usher in a new period of conflict that would test the very survival of the French kingdom. The competing claims of Philip of Valois and Edward III of England would lead to the H100 Red Years' War, a conflict that would devastate France and force a fundamental reconsideration the relationship between rulers and subjects. The kingdom that had seemed so secure under Philip the Fair would face challenges that would threaten its very existence. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the middle of the 14th century, would compound these political difficulties with a demographic catastrophe that would transform the entire structure of medieval society. The plague that killed perhaps 1/3 of the population would create labor shortages that would empower the surviving peasants to demand better conditions, while also undermining the economic foundations that had supported the expansion of royal authority. The social upheavals that followed the plague would create new forms of conflict that traditional governmental institutions were unable to address. The peasant rebellions that erupted throughout France during the 14th century would demonstrate the fragility of the social order that had supported royal government for centuries. The Jacquerie of 1358, the most serious of these uprisings, would reveal the depth of popular resentment against the nobility and the royal government that protected them. The brutal suppression of these rebellions would restore order temporarily, but it would also create new forms of social tension that would influence French political development for generations to come. The military disasters that France suffered during the early phases of the 100 Years' War would shatter the confidence that had sustained royal authority for centuries. The defeats at Sailles and Poitiers would demonstrate that French military superiority was not inevitable, while the capture of King John II at Poitiers would show that even the royal person was not immune to the fortunes of war. The ransom demanded for the king's release would create financial burdens that would strain the kingdom's resources to the breaking point. Yet, even in the darkest hours of the 14th century, the institutional foundations that the Capetian dynasty had created proved strong enough to survive the greatest challenges that medieval France had ever faced. The administrative system that Philip Augustus had established would continue to function even when royal authority was weakened, while the legal traditions that had been developed over centuries would provide frameworks for resolving disputes and maintaining order. The cultural achievements of the medieval period would provide inspiration and guidance for future generations of French leaders. The emergence of Joan of Arc in the early 15th century would demonstrate the enduring power of the ideals that had sustained French greatness for centuries. The peasant girl who claimed divine inspiration to save France from English domination would embody the Papillon loyalty that had been the foundation of Capetian success, while also representing new forms of national consciousness that would shape the future of European politics. Her victories at Orléans and Reims would restore French confidence and provide the momentum necessary for the eventual expulsion of the English from France. The long struggle to expel the English invaders would ultimately strengthen, rather than weaken, the French monarchy, creating new forms of national unity that would survive the challenges of the early modern period. The shared experience of foreign occupation would create bonds between different regions and social groups that had previously been separated by local loyalties and feudal obligations. The institutions that emerge from this struggle would provide the foundation for the absolute monarchy that would dominate European politics. In the following centuries, The transformation of medieval France from a collection of feudal territories into a unified nation was not complete with the end of the Hundred Years' War. But the essential foundations had been laid. The institutional structures that had been created during the preceding centuries would prove strong enough to survive the challenges of the early modern period. While the cultural and intellectual achievements of the medieval period would provide inspiration and guidance for future generations of French leaders, as the medieval period drew to a close, the kingdom that had emerged from the patient work of the Capuchin dynasty stood ready to face what challenges the future might bring. The institutions that had been created, the traditions that had been established, and the achievements that had been accomplished would provide the foundation for centuries of French greatness. The story of medieval France had reached its conclusion, but the legacy of that achievement would influence European civilization for generations to come. The long journey from the collapse of Charlemagne's empire to the emergence of a unified French nation had been completed through the accumulated efforts of generations of rulers who had understood that lasting greatness required more than military conquest or political manipulation. It demanded the creation of institutions that could survive individual rulers, traditions that could inspire popular loyalty, and achievements that could command international respect. The medieval French monarchy had succeeded in creating all of these things, establishing a legacy that would endure long after the medieval world itself had passed into history. And so, as the bells of Notre Dame rang out across the sleeping city of Paris, as the last candles flickered in the windows of the Louvre, as the night settled over the kingdom that had been forged through centuries of struggle and sacrifice, the history of medieval France came to its end. But it was not truly an ending. Fourth achievements of those distant centuries would live on in the institutions, traditions, and memorials of a people who had learned to call themselves French. The long sleep of history was beginning, carrying with it the dreams and aspirations of a civilization that had dared to believe that human greatness was possible, that kingdoms could be built to last, and that the patient work of generations could create something truly eternal. In the silence that followed the last echoes of medieval greatness, the seeds of the modern world were already beginning to sprout, nourished by the rich soil of accumulated achievement and watered by the tears of those who had given their lives to make France great. The story was ending, but the dream would continue, passing from generation to generation like a sacred flame that could never be extinguished. And in that continuity, in that unbroken chain of memory and aspiration, lay the true immortality of medieval France.